Hello again from the Paperback Warrior podcast. It's good to be back here again for this 91st episode. My name's Eric, and I'm on again today to talk about vintage paperback books in the Western, action, adventure, science fiction, mystery, and spy genres, among others. Our mission is fairly simple: to discover wonderful books by authors of the 20th century. We tell you about those books, the authors that wrote them, and often places you can obtain them. You should never ask anyone what you should read next. You should ask us. At paperbackwarrior.com, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of reviews and articles, as well as all of our social media platforms where we post daily. Now that I've got this introduction out of the way, let's talk about what's in store for today's very special episode. Now, first and foremost, our feature today is on an author that we just received tons and tons of feedback on and questions, and I think the people have spoken, and we are conducting today's feature on an author named William W. Johnstone. We're going to talk about series titles like Out of the Ashes, The Last Mountain Man, and so forth. I've got capsule reviews for some of Johnstone's books, and also my partner in crime, Tom, has an audio review that he recorded at his house, and he's also going to talk a little bit about what happened to the Johnstone Empire after William Johnstone's death. So I'm going to be playing that a little bit later, and I'm going to refrain from doing a review today outside of Johnstone's catalog, simply because this feature is massive. Now, as I'm recording this today, it's nearly Father's Day, and by the time you hear this, it'll probably be a week or so after Father's Day, but that doesn't really hamper our episode in the least. Today is just a really cool opportunity for me, and most of you out there have experienced some separation from your family members. With this crazy lockdown and pandemic, travel's just been really hard, and gosh, even the last year or so, it's been really hard just to go to the grocery store, let alone travel across the country to see your loved ones and friends. So finally, with this newfound freedom that we have right now, we're finally getting back to the real things that matter: our family, our loved one, our friends. And as most of you know, Tom and I live in Florida, and my side of the family, including parents, uncles, nieces, nephews, and what have you, are all in Virginia. My wife's side of our family is in Connecticut. Now, normally I get to see my parents either in Virginia or here in Florida at least maybe once or twice a year, and normally for a 3-4 day stretch. I'm an only child, so seeing my parents and remaining in their physical lives is important. And the last time I've seen them, I think, was way back in December of 2019 when my wife Sarah and I became married. In other words, the last time I saw them was around the time we recorded episode 24 of this very show, and now we're up to episode 91, so that's a long time, folks. As I've relayed to listeners here on the podcast, my dad is the reason why Paperback Warrior exists. I have photos of me as a toddler holding a Western paperback while my dad was holding me reading another Western paperback. So it's a family thing. At the beginning of elementary school, I can remember looking through all my dad's paperback books: the Louis L'Amours, the Zane Greys, the Max Brands, and Luke Shorts, and those strange Buchanan books. At any point, I could probably rummage through my dad's book cabinet or the boxes that he had laying around of books, and I could find things like Tarzan or John Carter of Mars, the occasional Tom Swift book. Even though I didn't necessarily choose to read those books at the time, I was still reading, and I was reading all kinds of genres, from horror to sci-fi to fantasy to military fiction and so forth. I always had a book in my hand, and my parents typically gave me an allowance each week, and I'd buy a book at the local Kmart every week or two. And so Dad, and to a degree my mom, are the reason why I'm a reader today. So now that the restrictions are off, my parents came down this week. So it's Father's Day. I'm recording an episode, so I thought it would be really cool to have my dad come on here with me just to talk about books, and specifically today's feature, and just kind of ramble with me here. And I'd already received permission from my partner Tom, and I promised Tom that he's not going to be replaced by my dad, that his Paperback Warrior 401k is still in place, his PTO is still going to be intact. I've cut through all the red tape, and now, here in the Paperback Warrior makeshift studio, I've got my dad here with us today, and I'm going to briefly interview him just to better understand where I get this reading from and book collecting passion, and maybe he can tell you a little bit about his life as well. So, Dad, introduce yourself and tell us your age and what you retired from doing.
My name is Chris Compton, and my age is 70. Was a union pipe fitter till I retired. I had a heart attack and had to quit work in 2011, and I've been retired since then, and I'm a veteran. I served in Vietnam, and I finished when I dropped out of school at 10th grade, and when I went to Vietnam, we had a lieutenant that would teach classes at night up to about 10 o'clock, and I went to school in Vietnam and got enough credits when I came back home that I could turn them in, and I got my GED.
So you had the Southeast Asia education, so to speak. That's how you finished school out, huh?
Yes.
That's pretty neat. Now I ever since I was old enough to remember, I can remember you coming home from the plant, and you would settle in, have supper or whatever, and then you would just read, typically until bedtime. What got you into reading at an early age? Can you remember what you were reading, way back then, and what got you into reading at such a young age?
At an early age, I discovered Zane Grey books, and they were on a level that I could read and understand, and I loved history. And Zane Grey books parallel a lot of the early history of the United States, like down through the Ohio River Valley and stuff. I mean, you think about it. This country, when we landed in Jamestown, and then we started spreading out as a country or as a colony. As we spread out, it was almost 100 years, if you think about this, before we had enough people in this country that forced our colonists across the Appalachian Mountains into what is known today as the Shenandoah Valley.
Yeah.
So it's been an exciting history book through Zane Grey books.
Yeah.
That we've learned a lot of history in just reading the early novels of the West.
And talking about that particular moment in history, that particular time period, and I think as I've gotten into reading more and more Westerns, and as the years go on, I feel like I'm gravitating more to reading the books about the Trailblazers, the Pathfinders, the musket era, I guess, of the American history, more like Westerns that are set in before 1800 or very early 1800s. And you turned me on to 4 books that really kind of got my interest peaked with this particular time frame. You turned me on to 4 Louis L'Amour books back when I was probably in middle school. This was Sackett's Land, To the Far Blue Mountains, The Warrior's Path, and a book called Jubal Sackett. These 4 books are books that Louis L'Amour wrote later in his career as sort of prequels to the gigantic Sackett family bibliography that he wrote. A lot of his books contain Sacketts or cousins of Sacketts or whatever it might be, but these 4 books went back and explained how the Sacketts arrived from England into the eastern part of the country, and then their slow progress westward towards Jubal Sackett, that 4th novel. But when did you discover those books, and really what got you into reading those 4 books in particular? Were you just a Louis L'Amour fan in general and just came across them?
Well, I was interested in Louis L'Amour. I grew older after I came out of Vietnam and stuff. I had read some, but then I got back into it. And like I say, I've always been interested in American history, and that kind of tells a story in another leg of history that kind of parallels what actually happened in the United States, but it goes off on a tangent kind of its own. Barnabas Sackett was the father of all the clan that came here, and he was actually outlawed because he was defending his rights, his homeland. He was attacked by a wealthy guy, a wealthy lord that didn't like what he was doing, and he was attacked and forced into fleeing for his life. So it's a long saga. It's a really good book if you want to read it.
Yeah, Sackett's Land is that story, and then
yes.
And then as it goes on, it goes into his 2 kids.
Yes.
With I think it's I can't think of their names, but they were in Warrior's Path and Jubal Sackett.
Yes.
Now you just read. I think I just gave these to you a while back, but you just read the Wagons West book, and I think there were 9 books total, and they star 2 brothers, Jeff and Clay, that grew up on a farm in the Ohio River Valley, and Jeff goes on a track with Lewis and Clark for 2 years. And then he finally comes home to the Ohio River Valley and rejoins his brother Clay. And then the two end up on a lot of adventures together, but they end up way out in the far west, and they journey up into the Canadian Rockies and so forth. You just read those books. Did you like them? What did you think of those?
Oh, I think they were great books. When you read a book and you got a good imagination, and you start to read these books, and you place yourself in their shoes, you can actually see the stuff that's going on. Back then, you can just actually visualize it in your mind, and you can see the woods, you can see the forest, you can see the trails, you can feel the hardships they went through, and you can feel the injustice because of people with power that's had money and stuff would do things to the poor and kind of force them into outlaws and stuff like that.
Well, talking about early history, you just finished up, almost finished up. You read the first 4 books of a series called The Patriots, and it's written under the name Adam Rutledge. That was the pseudonym used, but again, that was James Reasoner that wrote those as well. And they've been reissued under Reasoner's own name by Wolfpack, so you can still go out there and get those. Were those good? Did you like the Patriot books?
The Patriots is the beginning, actually before Concord, Massachusetts, before that fight even took place. It's the beginning, probably 3 or 4 years before the Revolutionary War started. And that was the groundwork, the first couple books, for the beginning of the Revolutionary War.
So these books kind of tell that story from what
they tell the whole story of how we got into the Revolutionary War and how George Washington took the Continental Army over and everything like that. So it went from just a rabble of colonists to an organized Continental Army, which was brutally outnumbered and outfought in a lot of ways because we just didn't have the arms and the means to sustain a long war. But we continued to hold on to it because of our freedoms. We knew if we didn't win this war, we had no other place to go.
Right.
So that's why the American colonists in these books fought so hard and so long. And it also goes in a little bit about the spies and stuff that was early in our American history.
Neat.
The Americans and how we got started, read those books.
Awesome. Now, you just turned 70 this week. You had a birthday. You turned 70 this week, and you were missing the last book in that series. And thankfully, it arrived just in time. So here you go. I'm going to hand you this book. You can tell them what I'm handing you. This is the last book in the series. What's the name of it?
It's called The Patriots, Stars and Stripes, and this was the 6th book in a series, and this carries all the way through. I've read 5 of them, but this is the 6th one. I'm excited about getting it.
Well, cool. I'm gonna keep Dad right here with us. Actually, I'm gonna keep him right here, and I'm gonna ask him some more stuff later on. But I'm gonna play a little intro lullaby to get us right into today's feature. Okay, today's feature is on author William W. Johnstone. He's arguably the most recognized action-adventure or Western author name you'll find at any bookstore, new or used. The Johnstone name has become an empire. Whether that's good or bad is up to you. For me, I just know I have to literally move stacks and stacks and boxes of Johnstone books to get to the used Westerns at retail stores. Along with Louis L'Amour and Ralph Compton, there's still new Johnstone titles hitting store shelves monthly at places like Walmart. Who the heck is William W. Johnstone? Why is he so popular? Who's J.A. Johnstone? Who the heck is using the William W. Johnstone house name today? We are plunging ourselves and you down the rabbit hole in today's feature on William W. Johnstone. So let's get started. He was born in southern Missouri in 1938. William's father was a minister, and his mom was a school teacher. Now, William quit school at age 15, and in his book, 4 Times a Killer, Johnstone says, and I quote, "I have the highest respect for education, but such is the folly of youth and wanting to see the world beyond the 4 walls and the blackboard." He's explaining that he ran away from home. In that same book, he states, "I saw Gary Cooper in a movie when I was a kid, and I really thought the French Foreign Legion would be fun." So what happened is William Johnstone joined the French Foreign Legion, but he was eventually kicked out because he was too young at the time. I want to say he was like 16 when he joined the French Foreign Legion, and he was kicked out for the age. So where does a kid go when he's away from home at a young age and he has no military to join? He joins the traveling carnival. He says he listened to all the veteran carny folks talking about their experiences and all their amazing tales, and it really got his imagination going. He said, quote, "They were mostly all honest people, despite the bad reputation that traveling carny shows had way back then. Of course, there were exceptions. There was one guy named Picky who got that name because he was a master pickpocket. He could steal a man's socks right off his feet without him knowing. Believe me, Picky got us chased out of a few towns." Now later, William Johnstone went back home to Missouri, and he graduated high school in 1957. Johnstone joined the sheriff's department in a place called Tallulah, Louisiana, and there he served as a deputy. He then later joined the U.S. Army and did a stint with them, and when he got out, he went into broadcasting, which I didn't know this. He spent 16 years of his life broadcasting radio for a station called KTLD in Tallulah, Louisiana. He also loved music, and he even recorded several songs, but I can't find them anywhere. And I think at some point maybe the Johnstone Empire is going to release these songs, but as of right now, I guess they're wrapped up pretty tight. Now, Johnstone started writing in 1970, but his first novel, The Devil's Kiss, wasn't published until 1979. This Devil's Kiss novel was the first of a 4-book horror series that was published between 1979 and 1987. Also, Johnstone did a lot of horror books, especially early in his career. Books like The Initiation from 1982, A Crying Shame from 1983, The Nursery from 1985, 1986's Rocking Horse, another one from 1986 called Jack in the Box, another one from the same year called Sweet Dreams. He also did a 2-book horror series about cats. He had Cat's Cradle in 1986, and then Cat's Eye from 1989. I guess Stephen King didn't oppose the title. Overall, he did nearly 30 horror novels between 1979 and 1992. In 1981, he saw his novel The Sanction published. It's an adventure novel, but it has a good dose of romance as well. Now, writing as William Mason, Johnstone authored a book called Dagger and another called Eagle Down, and both of these were written in the early 80s. Now, also in the early 80s, he wrote a book called The Dog Team. That was published in 1980, and it's reported to be Johnstone's favorite novel of everything he's written, The Dog Team. I've never read it. That became the first of 4 total books in what would later become the Dog Team series. But let's not get too far ahead. Instead, let's stop here on the timeline at February of 1983. This is the time period when William W. Johnstone hit the motherlode. The book was called Out of the Ashes, and it was published by Zebra. This novel kickstarted Johnstone into a retail powerhouse, and it also launched the Out of the Ashes series. The series ran from 1983 through 1998, with one additional book added after Johnstone's death in 2004. The books were reprinted time and time again, and I still see them to this day all over the used bookstores. And the titles are always something in the ashes, like Battle in the Ashes, or Slaughter in the Ashes, or Judgment in the Ashes. And I'm going to read you just the synopsis for the first book, just so you get a kind of an idea. Again, this is from the Out of the Ashes book from 1983. And it says, "The worst-case scenario has come to pass. A nuclear strike has crippled America. Gangs, looters, and vandals have seized the streets. The decent few can only pray for a leader to protect them. Luckily, one of the survivors is Ben Raines. Rebel mercenary, retired soldier, and tireless patriot, Raines is searching for his missing family in the aftermath of this devastating war. His relentless pursuit through the ruined cities of the West unites him with the civilians of the resistance forces. They become his recruits for a revolutionary army dedicated to rebuilding America. This comes the final outrage, an armed attack by government forces. With the fate of America's new patriots hanging in the balance, Raines vows to survive, find his family, and lead this once great nation out of the ashes." So it's a really great premise, and most of you know there were a lot of 1980s an early 1990s post-apocalyptic styled series. Probably the closest to Out of the Ashes is a series called The Survivalists by Jerry Ahern, and Endworld, which was written by David Robbins. Now, Dad, you've read the Out of the Ashes series at least twice all the way through it, and I know you love this series. In your version of it, what's the series really about? Like, from your version of reading the whole thing, what's it really about?
The series is about what happens after the world is devastated by nuclear wars.
Yep.
And this was a time in the 80s where everybody was afraid of the Soviet Union and other countries that had nuclear weapons of starting a third world war. Well, this book is based on a third world war. This series is. And out of this, Raines, he becomes General Raines. He's kind of forced into the leadership for the people that are oppressed, and a few of the rebels at that time that don't trust the government anymore. They are trying to find a leader, and they pick him to be their leader. And he puts a coalition together of all the American citizens, the blacks, the whites, the Chinese, anybody that will come to him. And it's a simple set of rules to follow. Just always do what's right and stick together.
Okay.
And this is what comes out of it. And it all comes out of the anarchy that's going on in the United States at that time. And you have to understand that all the other countries, the UK, Russia, all of them have been devastated. At the same time, all these other countries that have always hated the United States, they seize on this to come over here and try to take over. And Raines has to put his soldiers in harm's way time and time again to keep the biggest part of the United States. It comes down in these series. I'm not going to tell you a lot about it because you really need to read it. But it comes down in these series that the only places that are left for free-thinking American people is Louisiana and a couple of states around Louisiana. That becomes the home base for the rebels for a while. They tried it out west in the I believe it was Dakotas. It's been a while since I read them.
Yeah, I think it is.
And the U.S. government at that time, what was left of them, couldn't stand it because he was successful while they were still being tormented by gangs in the streets. And
with this, with the post-apocalyptic series, what I always like about these series, and I read a bunch of them too, is I like it when they bring in like monsters or mutants that have been, that rise out of this nuclear wasteland. Does the series have anything mutants or monsters or anything like that in it?
Yes, they do.
Oh, okay. I was always curious about that.
Yes, this book, they find out that there is mutants friendly to the Ben Raines's people because he just wants to leave them alone.
Right.
Just let live and live and let live is the theory that he goes by.
Right.
So he runs into mutants that are kind of like bears and human mixed.
Oh, okay. Wow.
But they're not humans and bears. It's just something from the radiation.
Like a
if you
hybrid.
have an imagination to figure it out a little bit.
Yeah.
But Raines befriends them and helps them. And another thing he helps them is a lot of orphanages, orphan children. They call it. In one of these books, he's got what he calls a children's brigade.
Oh, interesting.
And they're fighting on his side, and they live out in the wild, and they actually live with these sure mutants. They're friends to him, to the humans, and they kind of team up with Raines and help him out in a big way when the enemy comes after him. And there was another in his first attempt to bring the United States back together, but he ends up going from one end of this country to the other. He fights a huge war in New York City with people that are cannibals.
Oh, wow.
There's cannibals. That is his main goal, is to rid the United States of cannibalism.
Isn't that something?
And it all started back when the nuclear weapons was falling. It all started out with one person in the government that started out him, and it's just kind of like they infiltrated our government, and they stayed in the closet for years and years, kind of hidden and stuff. But for years, for 25, 30 years, they had been eating homeless people and stuff on the streets.
Wow.
getting them off the streets and eating them.
That's crazy.
And then when Raines comes on the scene, there's thousands of them. I mean, in New York, he fights almost probably 6 or 7 months in New York against a whole army of these people. But Ben Raines' number one weapon was a Thompson machine gun that he found in his town when he went at the police station. So he uses this thing throughout all his series, and they've rebuilt this thing because he's wore it out. They've rebuilt this thing to where there's no old parts in it at all.
The Thompson submachine gun?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's interesting because in most of these series, at that particular time in history, when these books were written, most of the heroes were using what they call the CAR-15, C-A-R-15. But it's interesting that he's using the Thompson machine gun, so that's something different. Did you, and this is something that was interesting to me that I didn't know, I was reading this, did you know that William Johnstone made the FBI watch list due to this series? They were concerned about some of the things he was saying, about the politicians and the government itself. So he made the watch list because of the books. That's pretty wild. But even with, let's say, I'm looking it up here, he sold, at that time, I guess, he sold 20 million copies of these Out of the Ashes books. And it's probably more now, but 20 million copies. So, he hit bank with the series. But Johnstone would still find another runaway hit. In 1984, Zebra published The Last Mountain Man. This book launched another empire for Johnstone, another money trail, so to speak, which was The Last Mountain Man series. And it's still running today. In fact, number 49 is scheduled to hit shelves this December. The Last Mountain Man introduced two key characters to the William W. Johnstone westerns that he would write for the remainder of his career. The first is his hero, Smoke Jensen, who is the Last Mountain Man, and the second is the Old Mountain Man introduced in the books. His name is Preacher. And Dad, you turned me on to the Last Mountain Man books when I was probably in middle school, and I read the first half dozen or so in the series. In fact, I would say the first book of the series, which is just simply called The Last Mountain Man, it's one of the better westerns that I've ever read, and its sequel, Return to the Mountain Man, was published in 1986, and it's not as good, but it's really good as well. Dad, I think you've read this whole series and probably read it twice all the way through. Do you like these books, and how would you describe, if someone asked you to describe Smoke Jensen, how would you describe Smoke Jensen to them?
Well, Smoke Jensen was a farmer's boy that grew up in Missouri. At the beginning of the Civil War, he was too young to fight in the Civil War, but his brothers and father went off to fight the war. It's called the Luke Jensen. He went off to fight in the Civil War, and his dad did. And he had a sister named Jenny. Well, not Smoke, but Kirby Jensen at the time. He gets his name later, but Kirby Jensen and his sister try to make a living on this farm. And during the Civil War, the James brothers, Jesse James and his brothers, and the Daltons came through on the farm, and what little bit of food they had and stuff, they were willing to share it with the James boys. And when James left, he left a .36 caliber muzzle loading pistol.
Yeah.
You load the cylinder just like you would a muzzle loader, but you just load the cylinders, and as the cylinder rolls around, it lines up with the barrel. He left him a .36. And when his dad comes back, his dad has what they called swamp fever, which was lung disease from tuberculosis or TB or something like that back then.
Yeah.
They didn't know. But he packs up the family. Jenny has already left. His sister's left with some kind of carpet salesman or something.
Yeah.
That was passing through, and she run off with him. So he don't see her for years, probably 10 or 12 years later before he runs into her. But the reason I like this story of the Jensens is because it kind of parallels the same thing as the Louis L'Amour books parallel.
The Sacketts. Yeah, the Jensens are.
Sacketts,
yeah.
Because it kind of parallels that, and it's got a lot of history in it. And his father and Kirby is traveling west. They come up on an old mountain man, and the mountain man, he was called Preacher.
Yeah.
And he was up in his 40s then. And they have an Indian fight. Preacher leads them off into a little ravine because he says they're being attacked.
Yeah.
Well, these two greenhorns, Kirby and his father, don't know anything about the Indian country. So the old mountain man saves his life, and during this fight, Smoke Jensen, he's set to guard their back, which is a river.
Yeah.
And he kills his first man in the river, which is an Indian. He finds another 36 caliber pistol, which gives him 2.
Yeah.
And he got his name because of the smoke coming out of the barrel.
Yeah. The cap and ball pistols.
On the cap and ball pistol. So Preacher gives him a nickname of Smokey.
Yeah.
Because of the smoke from the muzzle loaders and the pistols and stuff they was using.
Yeah, I read the first book. And in fact, I read the first 5 of these Last Mountain Man books. And you can find the reviews on paperbackwarrior.com. I've got the reviews there. And we reviewed The Last Mountain Man on... The Last Mountain Man #1, I should say, back on episode 7 of this show. So you can go back and listen to my review of Last Mountain Man there. But I will read you my capsule review for Return of the Mountain Man. This was the sequel. It came out in 1986, again, published by Zebra. My capsule review, real quick, this says, after the violent events of the series debut, Smoke Jensen lays low for a year or two, mourning and planning his vengeance. We can't tell you what happened in the first book because that'll ruin it for you, but something happened and he's got to have revenge. Soon he straps on the iron and sets out for the town of Berry, Idaho, where 3 outlaws, Potter, Stratton, and Richards, are running the town from money stolen from Smoke's father and brother. The narrative explores Smoke's fame after events from the debut novel, and due to his notoriety, he changes his name to Buck so he can secretly ease into town. And once there, he settles in as the average citizen while plotting a plan to attack and eliminate the 3 outlaws. Smoke's mentor, again Preacher, makes an appearance, and readers see a new love life in Smoke's life, a young schoolteacher named Sally, who becomes a mainstay series character. I didn't like this book as much as its predecessor, and it started to seem like a formula to me. Invent the villain, have Smoke identify them, bust them up while talking arrogantly, later kill them, and then go back home. And this book starts that whole formula, and Johnstone does it again and again through the series, and whoever they've hired to write the books now have to follow that same formula. It's always a land baron or some dirty politician, and the book always has a scene where somebody wants to fast draw Smoke in the streets or in a bar. And believe me, folks, Smoke never loses. He's never in jeopardy. He's never threatened. He never becomes injured. He's the immortal hero that's just absolutely perfect, and I just like that about him, and it kind of ruined it for me. Well, the Last Mountain Man series has spin-offs, and the first one was a series that Johnstone started in 1991 called The First Mountain Man, and it's up to installment number 27 from this year. And as you can probably guess, this series is a prequel to Last Mountain Man, and it tells the story of Preacher. When we meet Preacher in The Last Mountain Man, he's an old guy, but the First Mountain Man series captures his early days in the mountains and all the adventures and fights he gets into through the decades. Have you read any of the First Mountain Man?
Yes, I have.
Did you like them?
Yes.
Okay.
Like I was going to say, the Return of the Mountain Man starts kind of in the middle of this whole series, because you need to go backwards in time a couple years back to pick up on how he got to where he is today.
Okay.
But Arthur, he was the mountain man. And he run away from home at the age of 12, and he actually worked his way west, and he goes into New Orleans. And at New Orleans, he fights on Andy Jackson's side against British that's trying to take over the town of New Orleans. So
interesting.
He's 12 years old, and he's like he fought in New Orleans, and then he keeps moving west. So
well, let me ask you this one. There's more spin-offs, but the second one that I'm going to bring up is it's called Matt Jensen, The Last Mountain Man, as if it's not confusing enough with Last Mountain Man, First Mountain Man. Now you got Matt Jensen, The Last Mountain Man. This is an 11-book series so far, and the first book of the series was published in 2013. Dad, what can you tell me about Matt Jensen? Who is he?
Well, Matt Jensen was an orphan.
Okay.
And he was picked up by Sally and Smokey. He come to their ranch, and Smokey and Sally raised him as their own child.
Okay.
And he grows up and makes Smokey and Sally proud of the way he worked and the character he was. And when he leaves to go off on his own in these books, he takes the name of Jensen.
Oh, okay.
So he's
an orphan adopted by Sally and Smoke, and then he He basically just kind of becomes kind of like a Smoke character, just goes off on his own and has adventures.
He adopted the name and he becomes.
Well, there's also another series. It's 6 books. It was short-lived. It ran from 2010 to 2015. But these 6 books were called The Family Jensen. And these are kind of neat because these books feature Smoke, Preacher, and Matt all teaming up together to fight villains. I'm sure you've probably read those too, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, every year or so, one book is released in the Jensen Brand series. The Jensen Brand series started in 2017, and it's now up to book 4. And these books feature an older Smoke and Sally, but it really kind of focuses on their 2 grown twins, Denise and her brother Louis. And they return home from school in Europe, and they just begin, just picking up fighting off land barons and criminals from the farm. And I think it's a little bit of an adventure series based on just Denise and Louis, if I'm reading it correctly. Do you remember the Jensen Brand by any chance?
I haven't read those.
Yeah, I don't think that they're as popular. But the most popular of the Johnstone Westerns, at least I think from what I can read, the most popular is the Christmas series. These are books like Rocky Mountain Christmas, Colorado Christmas, Lone Star Christmas. And they started in 2011, and it's now up to book 11 this year. And some books feature the Jensen family. Some books feature the McAllister family, which we're going to talk about now. But the Christmas books are really popular, and I see those everywhere as well. So talking about the McAllister family, the McAllister series began in 2011, and it's up to book number 21 this year. And kind of like what Dad said earlier with what Louis L'Amour was doing, he made various families. I think he had 3 main families. It was the Sacketts, and then he had the Talons, and then he had the Chantrys. Well, Johnstone kind of did the same thing, or at least the Johnstone Empire did, and they came up with various families. So you had the Jensens earlier that we talked about. Now we're talking about the McAllisters. And these books star a guy named Duff McAllister, and he's a Scottish Highlands native who ends up saving a woman by killing her attacker. And the attacker was the sheriff's son, so McAllister jumps on a ship. He flees to America to start a new life in the Wyoming Territory somewhere in the late 1800s. Do you remember the McAllister series? Have you read it?
I've read, yes, about Duffy. He was outlawed by his own countrymen for saving a woman's life. In the process, she was killed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, his fiancée, when he was attacked, she was killed by the sheriff's son or the sheriff himself. I forgot how it all went. It's been a while since I read it. But anyway, Sky met her. He comes to Wyoming and names his ranch and stuff after her, called Sky Meadow.
Oh, okay.
And it's an interesting story, but it parallels the McAllisters, Falcon McAllister and different ones.
Yeah, I was getting ready to mention that. Because that's the you just mentioned 2 names that are important. The McAllister series, like you said, is related to Johnstone's Eagle series. Right? The Eagle series is like what you just said, Duff's ancestors, Falcon and Ian McAllister. And the Eagle series ran 18 total books from 1993 through 2013. And from what I could read, Dad, these books featuring Falcon and Ian McAllister take another wide look at American history because these 2, I think they're brothers or cousins or something. I want to say they're siblings. They show them fighting in the Alamo and the Civil War and so forth. Did you read this?
Yes.
Okay. Did you?
Janie McAllister was kidnapped by Indians, and he lived on an Indian village for about 2 years. And a white girl was at this village. Well, they escaped the Indians and make their way back into civilization again. And they ended up getting married, but her family didn't like Janie McAllister. But Janie McAllister was young. He was like about 16 at the time. He was kidnapped when he was about 13 or 14. But he lived with the Indians. So he learned a lot of tricks from the Indians on how to stay alive, different aspects of trapping and fishing and woodcraft and stuff. So he became good with the bow and arrow and all that stuff. But when they went down into East Texas, they went into a place called the Big Thicket in East Texas, and they set up their own little kingdom there. But her people keep trying to find her, and they eventually find them, and they have to fight to get out of there. But people that he knows and treated good, they follow him, and they set up a place in what later on is McAllister's Valley. He ends up owning about 10,000 acres of it, and the whole town, McAllister's town, becomes his own domain. But he treats everybody, so he's got a lot of people there that ain't even kin to him.
Okay.
But he's being pursued by outlaws or somebody hired to kill him by his wife's people. They get to where they don't even want her alive, so they try every way they can to kill him. But this tells a lot of the history and the landscape and stuff down around Texas and on up through into Colorado, all that western part of the land.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Yeah, and I was kind of torn on all these series and if they were any good or not. But so far from what we've reviewed so far, some of these books I really do want to read. They do sound very interesting, and I do want to try them. But well, let's switch gears for a second. Let's move from westerns to highway vigilantes. I'm talking about the Rig Warrior series. It initially ran from 1987 through 1988 with 3 total novels, and the series was continued last year with a 4th entry in this series. Now, I had a chance to read and review the series debut, which was simply called Rig Warrior. And you can find that review on paperbackwarrior.com, but I'll give you a brief version of that. Rig Warrior was published in 87, and it was followed by the 2 sequels in 88, Wheels of Death and 18-Wheel Avenger. And then last year, the Johnstone Empire released the 4th book in the series, which is called Knockdown. But in the series debut, readers are introduced to Barry Rivers, a former Special Forces guy that served in the Vietnam War. After service, Rivers went into consulting work and established an extremely profitable firm. Now, his father is an owner-operator for Rivers Trucking, an employer that Barry drove for before going to Vietnam. Barry learns that the business has been targeted by the mob and that his father has been badly beaten by them. So Barry takes a vacation from his firm, and he starts driving for his father's business again. He gets in the trucks and starts heading out on the highway trying to figure out who's after his dad. Soon he learns that the business is running government contracts and that certain parts of the FBI are shipping drugs in these freights. It's a really kind of an elementary storyline until we realize that there's mad scientists involved, and along with the drug trafficking is an expansive operation involving corpses being used in all these freakish experiments. Rivers Trucking, unknowingly, is supplying labs with these cadavers, and in turn they're subjected to Frankenstein kind of experiments. It was almost kind of like that old movie with Dolph Lundgren and Jean-Claude Van Damme, A Universal Soldier. Kind of like that sort of concept. Now, William W. Johnstone is always ultra-conservative, and I think that's not going to surprise anyone, but he's really, really ultra-conservative in these books. He's always talking about the government and police can't be trusted and sort of the phobia, but I thought the book overall was kind of silly, and I thought it was poorly written, and it just came across as sort of immature, but by the end of the book, there's a twist, and I'm not going to ruin it for you, but I'm going to say that twist was intriguing enough to make me want to read the sequel. I really did like the way that the book ended, and I'm really curious about the sequel. I just haven't had a chance to sit down and read it yet. You haven't read the Rig Warrior books, have you, Dad?
No, I haven't.
No. Let's talk about, well, I guess let's talk about we're almost done, by the way. Let's talk about a supernatural action hero series that William Johnstone wrote called the Ransom series. And it's really just 2 books, 1995's Hunted and the 1996 sequel called Prey. And this premise is about a man named Ransom who can shapeshift into a wolf. And through the 2 books, he's hunted by this shadowy government agency. And you know what? I've never actually heard anybody mention these books before or even talk about reading them. I've never heard any really reviews about them. But Dad, you read these 2 books. I know you've read them a couple times, and you really, really liked them. What can you tell us about these books?
Like the Indians for years and years thought that there was always some person out there. They call them shapeshifters.
Right.
And this starts out with just a normal guy. He started out in I forgot what country it was, but he's just a kid. And he don't shapeshift.
It's kind of hard to say.
Till he's about 16 years old. And because of the strangeness and the way he is, his family was persecuted, and I think his mother was burned at the stake or something. But he leaves his homeland and comes to the United States, and it starts out with the government, some kind of secret government agency, is trying to prove that his existence is what they're really after first.
Mm-hmm.
So
they're trying to basically track him down to identify that that it's the real thing.
Yes, and it goes from there, and it's really interesting book if you like stuff like that, and I'd recommend you to read it.
Would you say it's an action adventure book, or is it a horror novel?
It's kind of a mixture of both.
Okay, so that's interesting.
But he goes out of his way to help people, and especially the rangers and stuff in the district where he's living. He lives up in the mountains, and he can go miles and miles because they don't realize how he's traveling so much. But he can change into a wolf, and he can travel what a human would travel in a day. He can travel in overnight because he can travel at night because he can see. And he shows up at the stores and stuff in this little old remote trading post at odd hours and stuff, and they don't know how he's seeing to get back to his cabin and stuff.
Right.
But they don't figure it out. But a news reporter figures it all out, and he falls in love with her, and it kind of goes off as a love story too.
Years and years ago, and I had read somewhere on one of the online forums that there was a book before these two, Hunted and Prey. There's a book that Johnstone wrote before those two books, and I think it was a horror novel. I can't remember. Maybe somebody out there can educate me, but there's supposedly a first book that basically talks about the shape-shifting power or curse or whatever in this tiny village in Europe. But I think it's a horror novel. I don't know the name of it. I know William Johnstone wrote it, and the series is really considered a trinity of books, a trio of books, but I only know of the two, and I own both those paperbacks. But here's something interesting that I was reading about when I was researching this feature, and I don't know if this is related or not, but if we think about what they did with Rig Warrior, 3 books from the 80s, and then last year they came out with a 4th novel. I'm not sure if this is related, but in September of this year, there's going to be a Johnstone book being released called To the River's End, and it stars a hero, or a protagonist, named Jake Ransom. And Jake Ransom is headed into the Pacific Northwest to become a trapper for the American Fur Company in the early 1800s. Now, there's nothing about the cover that would suggest that this is a supernatural, Western type of story. Instead, it seems more in line with just a pioneer Western, kind of like Last Mountain Man, or maybe something that James Reasoner would write with the Wagons West prequels, something like that. I'm not sure, obviously I'm not sure who wrote this book because Johnstone is just a house name. We don't know who writes them. But I'm really looking forward to reading this book, and I don't know if this Jake Ransom is related to the same Ransom that's in those other 2 books, but I guess we'll find out in September. So let's look at the facts. William Johnstone died in 2004. Since his death, over 200 novels have been written by unknown authors using the house name of William W. Johnstone. Without counting, I'm guessing there have been over 50 brand new series started using the house name of William W. Johnstone after his death. This is a huge, huge empire. Now, I'm going to bring Tom on to review a standalone contemporary thriller from William Johnstone, but Tom is also going to discuss Johnstone's estate after his death. So he's going to kind of take over from here and finish out the feature, and then I'll be back.
Hello, Paperback Warrior listeners. This is former co-host of the show, hard-boiled private detective Tom Simon here with a very quick segment. First, greetings to you, Eric, as well as Eric's father, Mr. Compton, who I understand is our guest subject matter expert on all things William Johnstone. I want to take this opportunity to touch a little bit on William Johnstone's writing career after he died and address a little bit of the political content of his work and talk about some of his contemporary novels. So William Johnstone died in Knoxville, Tennessee on February 8, 2004 at the age of 65. But his death was not widely publicized for 2 years afterwards because books kept being released ostensibly by Mr. Johnstone. It wasn't until 2006 that his literary estate and publisher quietly acknowledged on a paperback's copyright page that Mr. Johnstone had died and a, quote, carefully selected author, end quote, would be writing his works from that going forward. The book that first contained this revelation was a Western called Slaughter Trail from 2006. And it was at that time, around that time, that we began to see the name J.A. Johnstone credited as a co-author on his paperbacks. And readers just assumed that this carefully selected author who had taken on the Johnstone mantle was somehow William Johnstone's son, J.A. The truth, however, is a bit more shadowy. The first thing to understand is that J.A. Johnstone is William's niece, Joanne. Now, she controls the literary estate of William Johnstone, but she's not an author herself, to my knowledge. She was William Johnstone's typist and research assistant growing up from a very young age, and she did a lot of work for him as far as getting it right when it came to the history of the Old West. So since his death, Johnstone's publisher, which was first Pinnacle and then Kensington bought Pinnacle, has been releasing several books a year, now mostly Westerns and contemporary thrillers, in Johnstone's name. We think back to what we know about Gold Eagle, which was the imprint owned by Harlequin, who continued publishing the Executioner books starring Mac Bolan after Don Pendleton moved on. But the real authors of those books are acknowledged on the paperback's copyright page. Now, when it came to the Johnstone universe, Kensington took a very different approach. It seems to be very important to Kensington, basically to fool the readers into thinking that Mr. Johnstone is still alive and writing these books, or at the very least, J.A. Johnstone, his son or relative of some kind, is the one writing the books. Now, there's actually a handful of ghostwriters employed by Kensington to write these books in the Johnstone names. But those guys sign non-disclosure agreements saying they won't publicly acknowledge that they are William Johnstone's ghostwriters. And if you do what I did and dive deep into the U.S. Copyright Office records, there's no evidence of the real authors. Kensington is completely paranoid that someone may find out that these books are not, in fact, being written by a 15-year-old corpse. Now, longtime listeners to the Paperback Warrior podcast know that I love a good literary mystery. So I did some digging to determine who these ghostwriters are. And keep in mind that because of the paperback distribution deal that Kensington has with Walmart, that William Johnstone remains one of the best-selling authors in America. The people who are writing these books are very well compensated, and they're quietly the most popular writers on planet Earth right now, but their names aren't ones that people would ever recognize. Now, I was able to track down and interview two of the authors who spoke to me under the strict promise that I would not disclose their names to the Paperback Warrior audience. I don't want to destroy the livelihood of these guys or place them in legal jeopardy. I'm going to honor that promise. Now, my takeaway from the conversations is that these ghostwriters, particularly the ones working under this Johnstone name, they're pragmatists. They're people who want to make a living by writing novels, and they don't really care if their names are on the books or if a dead guy's name's on the books. They're paid well, better than they would if they had written the books themselves, and they do get satisfaction knowing that so many people are enjoying their writing. The trade-off, of course, is that the reader doesn't get to know who really wrote these books. Now, culturally, there's something interesting going on here that bears addressing. Most of the Johnstone books are Westerns, and they're very mainstream Westerns, and either you like that type of thing or you don't. And the authors crafting and writing these Westerns clearly know what they're doing, and the book sales reflect that. However, there's a different William Johnstone line of products that are ghost-written, and they're right-wing thrillers, and I find them just culturally fascinating. They're exciting and violent novels that are filled with Fox News-style right-wing stereotypes designed to appeal to readers who share that worldview. Let's talk about a couple of them. In 2014, there was a William Johnstone book called Stand Your Ground about Islamic terrorists who take over a prison seeking to have their imprisoned friends released after the President of the United States agreed to allow civilian trials of terrorists who were formerly held at Guantanamo Bay. Now, the right-wing Johnstone formula sets up the basically liberal and left-wing straw men for the readers to hate. These characters are usually woke college professors, bleeding heart liberal journalists, and of course, Muslim radicals. It's liberal bashing, but it's more like a piñata party because there's no actual liberals there to present their worldview, just the caricatures cooked up by the ghostwriter working for Kensington. The book, Stand Your Ground, even implies that the president of the United States, who at the time was a Protestant Christian named Barack Obama, was secretly a Muslim. So classy stuff here, right? But again, it's a well-written thriller that really just serves as red meat for that audience. The 2018 William Johnstone right-wing thriller was called Trigger Warning, and it takes place on this liberal college campus filled with spoiled, coddled, ultra-liberal students who are way into being triggered by microaggressions, and they spend a lot of time discussing male privilege and safe space, and they're outraged by cisgendered bathrooms. Basically, every liberal stereotype designed to freak out old men. So there's this former Army Ranger who is attending this college. Don't ask me why he would subject himself to this. And a violent gang of marauders take over the school, and it becomes Die Hard on a college campus. The reader gets to see how a real man can rescue and save these wimpy liberals. Now, I read the 2016 Johnstone thriller called Black Friday, and I have to admit, I really enjoyed it. It's basically Die Hard in a mall on the day after Thanksgiving, where Americans tend to do their Christmas shopping. Once again, the bad guys are Islamic terrorists. They take over the mall while inept law enforcement outside are paralyzed by their politically correct bosses. A group of shoppers band together to stand their ground and fight the Muslims. It's filled with a lot of right-wing silliness. Like there's a character who's like shooting down the terrorists as they're like piling into the mall, and he's growling like, "Thank God for the Second Amendment," as he's shooting them. There's nothing wrong with the book as a thriller, and I admit it, even though I don't really like any political content in my novels. And I don't have a problem with anyone reading and enjoying right-wing books. During his life, William Johnstone himself was a conservative Christian, so it can be argued that these books are just continuing the literary tradition that he was a part of during his life. There's also very successful, genuinely conservative authors writing excellent right-wing thrillers today. Brad Thor comes to mind as a guy who's got that as his niche. My philosophical problem with the Johnstone right-wing thrillers is that they're ordered up by Kensington as products designed to sell books to that audience. Neither the business people at this Manhattan publishing house nor the talented ghostwriters they employ believe any of this stuff. All they're doing is throwing metric tons of stereotypes and straw men at Walmart shoppers because they think that's what you want to hear. It reminds me of professional wrestling. Sergeant Slaughter really didn't hate the Iron Sheik, and they both thought I was stupid when I was a teenager and I cared so deeply about the honor of Sergeant Slaughter and the depravity of the Iron Sheik. I was a mark, I was a fool, I was an idiot, and they knew it. I was being had by smarter people than me, whose only goal was to separate me from my money. Now, to be clear, the left wing has no shortage of writers making fun of working-class, gun-toting white Americans, and I find that despicable as well. But at least you know that the authors and people behind the left-wing books are sincere and truly have contempt for the straw men in their novels. I would say the same thing about Brad Thor on the right-wing side. He's giving you his worldview, and he has real contempt for liberals. My problem with the Johnstone thrillers is that the only ones that the publishers and the authors seem to have contempt for are their own readers for believing the cartoonish stuff they write and put out. Anyway, that's my spot on the Johnstone right-wing thrillers. They can be a lot of fun as novels, but you may or may not want to let them inform your worldview. If you're interested in reading what conservatives think, maybe read something by a real conservative. If you're interested in what a liberal thinks, maybe read something by a real liberal. Or maybe forego political content altogether and just enjoy a good story. Anyway, this is Tom from Paperback Warrior. Thanks for having me on. Be cool, everybody.
Now, we've just touched on just a number of series and books by William W. Johnstone. Honestly, there's just too many to even cover, and there's more and more being released monthly. For a really comprehensive look at the Johnstone estate's bibliography, just visit williamjohnstone.net. There's a PDF there that you can download, and it's massive. And that brings me to the end of this feature. William W. Johnstone, hugely popular author. Again, we get a lot of feedback from him. about him and questions about him. So hopefully you enjoyed the feature. Hopefully you enjoyed the two-sided conversation here about William Johnstone's career and legacy. And Dad, as closing this out, did you have a good time today?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Good. I hopefully next time you come down, we'll be able to do this again.
Yes.
All right. So in the meantime, visit paperbackwarrior.com every weekday for a brand new review. And also visit our social media, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, all that jazz. Stay tuned for updates on the next podcast episode there. And for Eric and Eric's dad, Chris, we're signing off now. Bye-bye.